understanding.
Now, why don't we move on to the officer point?
Certainly.
And Justice Jackson, I think you...
Yeah, so I had a question about it because you're making a textualist argument. And as I look at Section 3, I see two parts of the first sentence of Section 3. The first is a list of offices that a disqualified person is barred from holding. And the second are specific circumstances that give rise to disqualification. So first, am I right about seeing that there are two different things happening in the first sentence of section? Okay.
For sure.
So are you arguing both in this case or just one? Are you arguing both that the office of the presidency should not be considered one of the barred offices and that a person who previously took the presidential oath is not subject to disqualification?
We are arguing both, Your Honor.
I don't see that in your brief.
Well,
I see a lot of focus on the second, but not on the first.
There is definitely more focus on the second, and we acknowledge that we have a somewhat heavier lift on the first point.
Why? It seems to me that you have a list and president is not on it.
That's certainly an argument in our favor, but there are also, with respect to officer of the United States, that's used repeatedly in the Constitution, in the Commissions Clause, in the Appointments Clause, and also in the Impeachment Clause. And every time it appears, it's used in a way that clearly excludes the
No, I
president.
understand, but that's
So
the
we don't-
second argument. So the
That is.
first
And the-
argument is we have a list of offices
Yes.
that a person is barred from holding, right?
Yes.
Under your theory or under the language of, and we see it begins with senator, representative, elector of
Elector.
president and vice president, and all other civil or military officers.
Well, offices under the United States.
Offices under the United States.
How
But
it's
the
phrased.
word president or vice president does not appear specifically
That's
in
right.
that list. So I guess I'm trying to understand, are you giving up that argument, and
No.
if so, why?
No, we're not giving it up at all. You're right, the president and the vice president are not specifically listed. But the Anderson litigants claim that they are encompassed within the meaning of the phrase office under the United States.
And do you agree that the framers would have put such a high and significant and important office, sort of smuggled it in through that catch-all phrase?
We don't agree at all. That's why we're still making the argument that the presidency is excluded from the covered offices that are listed at the beginning of Section 3.
I'm sorry. Your brief says you didn't take a position on that point.
I'm sorry.
And your brief said, I don't have the site, I apologize. You don't affirmatively argue that point, I think is what your brief said.
In the blue brief?
Yes.
Well, we certainly argued it in the reply brief, and I'll have to look at how we phrased it. But we did point out in our opening brief that there are potential issues if this court were to rule on office under, because that phrase appears in other parts of the Constitution, including the Emoluments Clause, the Impeachment Disqualification Clause.
Would we
and the
necessarily
Accountability
have to
Clause.
say, I mean, I thought the point was that Section 3 was unique, that there was something happening with Section 3 that could explain why certain offices were left off or whatnot.
Perhaps, but there are also implications from other parts of the Constitution which really help us on the officer of the United States argument in that second part of Section 3, but somewhat cut against us when it comes to office under the United States. And the Anderson litigants point this out in footnote 9 in the red brief, where they say if this court were to say the presidency is an excluded office under the United States, that could imply, for example, the president is not covered by the emoluments